Active Imagination, Part 2 of Jung and Spirituality. Hello, this is Chris speaking, Shores of Infinity, with another video about spirituality and Jung, this time active imagination, symbology, mythology, archetypes, and fantasy. Stop daydreaming! Stop daydreaming is what we heard many times from our parents, or especially in school or schools. In our culture, it's very bad to daydream. It's considered to be a huge waste of time, but it's not. Without daydreaming, we would go insane. Just like without dreaming during the night, we would go insane. We need dreams and daydreaming to stay stable. You probably know the image, the famous Freudian image of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg is above the surface, but the main part of the iceberg is below the surface. Another image would be ripples and waves on the ocean or on the river. This is our usual daily reality. And below that, the whole ocean and the river, below the surface, is the other reality, the unconscious, or the subtle world, or the vital world. When you do active imagination, something like active daydreaming, or vision search, you're not wasting your time, nor are you just talking to yourself or letting your thoughts run wild. No, it's a way to talk to yourself, but not the usual self, not what you usually call I, the ego. You're talking to one of the other selves, one of many selves, an interpersonal conglomeration of selves, whom Jung called archetypes. For example, the tyrant, the magician, the inner child, and so on. Probably heard about the inner child. Is one of those archetypes. And they do exist. They are real. It's not that they are just imagination. What is that supposed to be? Just imagination. They are real in the unconscious, in the subtle world. And what we call reality is just one of many realities. And those other realities or worlds are as real or unreal as the gross physical reality we usually call reality, just on another level. In Indian tradition, it's called a higher level. And in Jungian tradition, it's called a lower level, but not low as less good, but low as below. It's what is happening below the surface of the river or the ocean, or your daily reality, what you call reality. And once you contact this lower level, you can get to know parts of your usually fragmented self which you didn't really know. A little bit. You knew them a little bit, but not much. You didn't really notice them as personalities. You noticed them as moods, or things that come up for a few seconds or minutes. But now you can really talk to them, notice them, reintegrate them. They want to be heard, and they will make themselves heard. If you don't want to listen to them, they will make themselves heard in another way, in an uncomfortable way. Unfortunately, there are parts that you or your ego has refused to listen to in the past. Not as a child, but later on, because we have been taught in this modern culture not to listen to it, not to take it seriously. It's just imagination, just fantasy. But imagination and fantasy, they are faculties of the human being, which are important. There are senses like seeing, hearing, smelling, and so on, which are useless in this other world. In this other world you need other faculties, other kind of seeing. We call this imagination, which means to make things which are invisible, visible. Now, because you used to ignore them up till now, they will maybe not initially at once want to talk to you, because they don't trust you. You have ignored them for decades. So first there needs to be a contact making, a peacemaking. It's not that you can just close your eyes, say, okay, now I'm doing active imagination, please archetypes, show yourselves to me. This doesn't work, can't work, because your ego is not in control of those. It's again, to want imagination, active imagination to happen, is again the ego trying to take control. The ego has no power in the unconscious, because it's not part of the unconscious. The ego is the so-called conscious part, but it's also outside of the unconscious. It cannot enter the unconscious. It can only talk to the unconscious. And it sure as hell can't control the unconscious. About 20 years ago, there was a movie called Pathfinder about a young First Nation Indian who goes on a road trip with his grandfather, and his grandfather is telling him stories. He's a professional storyteller. That used to be the case in most cultures. They had storytellers, and these stories were full of symbols and archetypes. Nowadays we call them myths or fairy tales or just superstition. But all these fairy tales, from whichever culture you come from, they are myths, and myths speak the language of the unconscious. All these symbols hidden in those myths and stories, they mean something. The old Star Wars trilogy, for example, is full of those myths, because George Lucas wrote the script together with Joseph Campbell, who was one of the major mythologists of the time. The hero, for example, is one of those archetypes. This is also what appeals to all these Marvel superhero movies. Yeah? There's the hero archetype hidden in those. They're not really hidden, they're only hidden because we learned those are just stories. It's just fantasy. Many people say they don't read science fiction or fantasy novels, or don't watch science fiction or fantasy movies because it's just fantasy. It's not real. They want to read or watch real stories. Well, they are real in another world, in the subtle world, in the unconscious. Only the unconscious talks in another language. It doesn't talk in English or German or French or Chinese or Tamil or whatever. It talks in symbols, in symbology. That's the language of the unconscious. So, to talk to your unconscious super personalities, to your archetypes, you need to learn how to understand, listen to, read the language of symbols. Jung has written a lot about it. Also, if you do this kind of work like dream work and active imagination, it's good to have a psychologist, a Jungian psychologist on hand, or someone else who has tried this already. The other thing is, when you start your active imagination, don't censor anything. Try not to judge anything. Just let it run. But as I said, you can't expect these just to come. You really have to wait and make some peace offers, probably. Those inner children, they are annoyed. Just like in the movie I mentioned, the Pathfinder, the young First Nation Indians there in those stories, they go out to search for the spirit and command the spirit to show itself, but that's not how it works. You have the spirit, you have the archetypes come to you on their own accord, in their own time. The only thing you can do is be patient and wait for them. And it might take longer than a few minutes. But the good thing, the easy thing is, you probably all know this, when you meditate or try to meditate, then the voice or the voices in your head keep babbling. And in active imagination, you can let them keep babbling. You don't have to have a still mind. The goal of active imagination is not to still your mind, to silence your mind. It's the opposite, is to allow your unconscious to talk. So you will have to wait a while, and maybe it will take a few trips there until they start talking to you. They want to talk to you. They are talking to you all the time, actually, but usually you don't listen. So you have to learn how to listen with patience. This is one of the reasons why I said 2 years ago that boredom is your best friend. You can actually not be bored. If you're bored, it just means you don't listen. Once you do nothing, once you stop distracting yourself with external things, internal things will well up. They are there waiting for the opportunity. And when they well up, when they come up, when they rise up above the surface, or you dive down below the surface, some people call it deep diving also for that reason, then you better start listening. And don't put it away as craziness or fantasy or imagination. That's just our cultural programming. Those things that are down there in the unconscious are as real as what you usually call reality, or as unreal. You can either say everything is real or nothing is real, but you cannot choose, your ego can't choose this is real and this is unreal. It doesn't have the knowledge to do that. So for active imagination, you need time. You need time. As I said in the last video about art, you can make an appointment, for example. You can say, 1 hour every day I will do this. There's time for this. And in the beginning it will be boring, or all kinds of super ego voices will come. No, don't do this, you're wasting your time. But the opposite is true. You're not wasting your time with active imagination. You usually waste most of your time of the day with distraction. That's the truth. Talking to your unconscious, to your other parts that also belong to you, to your larger self. And not just staying in one fraction of your larger self. And you identified with your ego. And many people ask, how do I de-identify with my ego? It's very simple. You start talking to your other parts and see that you do have other parts. That your ego is not the only personality in there. So on the path of enlightenment, to get to know those other parts should be your primary goal, not something that you don't have time for. Yet on the other hand, when you do this deep diving, it can suddenly turn out that you open the Pandora's box. This is one of the other reasons why people don't dare do it, because they're actually afraid of it. Well, nothing horrible will come out, but a lot might come out. Yeah, if you open the sluice, then suddenly all the pent-up water will flush out. Maybe. Not always, but it can happen. Actually, it happens rarely, but it can happen. And then you will need a lot of time. You may need help, but not necessarily. What you actually may need is much more time. You may maybe need to take a few days off to finish this conversation. That's why in the old days of older cultures, people went by themselves into the wilderness for a few days. There they had a lot of time on hand. But initially, you still have to learn how to talk to the unconscious, so this will not happen. First, you have to learn how to talk to it, and then you can see how much time you need to continue, or if this method is the right one for you. But I think it's a folly not to try it out at least. There are several methods, like I said, art, daydreaming, dream work, journaling, vision quest. They're all for the same reason, and you don't have to do all of them. One that works for you is enough. But if you haven't tried it out, and if those other methods weren't super effective, I recommend trying it out. Interesting things will come up. You don't need to take any psychedelics to open the gates to the unconscious. It's not necessary. This Jungian work of active imagination is very similar to what Carlos Castaneda wrote about. He said actually the goal of the kind of shamanistic work he learned is to dream all the time. And this is the explanation here. What did he mean with it? There were so many misunderstandings about what he wrote. It's very clear. Active imagination. And also in his books, he asks his teacher all the time, is it real what I'm experiencing? Or do I just imagine it? This is a nonsensical question. There is no just imagining it. It is also real. Imagination is also real in another world. This is similar to, I sometimes get asked, are the acupuncture meridians, the nadis, are they real? Yes, they are real. In the subtle world, in the vital world, in the unconscious. They're real, and they have an effect on the rest of the being. They're just not visible. It's very stupid to think only what's visible is real. There are plenty of things we can't see. You can't see the wind, for example, and yet you never claim that the wind is not real. Well, you could argue, well, I can feel the wind, or I can see the wind is moving the trees, so indirectly I know it's there. Well, indirectly you know very well that the unconscious is real. It affects you all the time. All these unbidden thoughts and emotions, that's where they come from. So indirectly you already know it's real. So instead of just being pummeled around by it, like the tree in the wind, or a leaf in the wind, why not just talk to it and see if there's a peaceful solution here? Okay, that's it for today. Thank you to all my patrons. Thank you for joining me as a patron. Thank you for liking and subscribing and sharing the videos with your friends. And see you soon.